Hi to everyone, I'm Francesco Caprioli and I'm postdoctoral researcher in early modern history at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. In this lesson, we will discuss the movement of people, ideas, and objects across religious and political borders, paying particular attention to those movements that took place in the early modern Mediterranean context. As a structure, we will start by defining the concept of border, a fundamental step to present our main topic. As a result of this first section, we will explore several kinds of movements across religious and political borders. Thus, we will point out the actors who moved willingly or unwillingly across the Mediterranean Sea, how and where they moved, concluding our lesson by talking about objects in motion. When we speak about early modern Mediterranean, what borders are we talking about? Looking at this image, we don't notice the presence of any visible political frontier in that context. From the Iberian Peninsula to the North Africa via the Middle East, there seems to be no obstacles between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim societies and cultures. In this sense, we can understand the Mediterranean as a common space shared by all these human groups. Actually, starting from the Middle Ages, a series of new frontiers were defined based on different religions, cultures, and political spaces. Particularly, the 16th century Ottoman-Habsburg clash for Mediterranean supremacy brought about the consolidation of such frontiers. As a result, the early modern Mediterranean context was divided into two areas. In one hand, a Christian northwestern Mediterranean defended by the Spanish Habsburg, and on the other hand, a southeastern Mediterranean under the control of the Ottomans. However, this strict separation was more theoretical and used for propaganda purposes. In reality, people, ideas, and objects continued to cross religious and political frontiers all the time. The understanding of Mediterranean border as contact zone rather than frontiers that divide two worlds allow us to avoid emphasizing distorted views of the history of this sea. Contact, exchange, and movement are therefore key elements in understanding how complex Mediterranean daily life was. Since the Middle Ages, the Mediterranean was an area characterized by high mobility. Its surface has seen the most intensive contact between those living on its shores. Peoples, galleys, and ideas have moved back and forth across its borders. Such a high level of mobility can be summed up according to three elements shaped by commercial, religious, and political issues: trade, pilgrimage, and war and diplomacy. Let's start with trade. Despite war and prohibition to trade in some ports due to religious or medical restriction, like the ban on Christians negotiating with Muslims in times of war or the local restriction due to the spread of plague in city ports, travelers and merchants circulated daily between Christian and Muslim borders, giving rise to an intercultural trade and intensified the circulation of ideas and practical knowledge between different societies. Let's now continue with pilgrimage. Beside the journeys of merchants, we find pilgrims as other actors in motion in the early modern Mediterranean. In order to fulfill their duties and visit the holy cities, Christian believers traveled to Jerusalem through the lands of the Ottoman Empire, while Muslim believers traveled along the Mediterranean routes to the east to reach the ports from which they start their final journey to Medina and Mecca. In so doing, they cross multiple political borders, risking their lives due to the presence of the enemy's army, or bandits, or pirates as well. Finally, war and diplomacy. Alongside economic and religious needs, political issues also stimulated movements in the Mediterranean arena. To face rivals on the battlefield, Mediterranean powers were constantly moving galleys and soldiers back and forth from one shore to another. At the same time, diplomatic agents traveled between courts to mediate in political conflicts, conclude peace treaties, or spy on the enemies. But not all the actors, however, moved voluntarily in the Mediterranean. The war between the Spanish monarchy and the Ottoman Empire amplified the phenomenon of slavery. As they fell prisoner on the battlefield or raided by corsairs, many Christians and Muslims were forced to leave their countries and migrate on the other side of the Mediterranean. While on several occasions these slaves renegade their religious belief to acquire greater social rights in the new geopolitical context, many preferred to wait to be ransomed by merchants and freers and return home safely. Among these voluntary movements, we can include also the massive displacement or diasporas of religious communities produced by political decision, such as the 1494 Jewish expulsion from the Crown of Castile and Aragon, or the expulsion of the Moriscos from the Iberian Peninsula following the decisions made in 1609 by the Spanish Habsburg government. So far we have talked about who crossed the borders and why, but now we will stop briefly on the spaces where this movement happened. Alongside the two main contact zones, the Maghreb and the Balkans, there were also secondary scenarios in which we can observe Mediterranean movements like ports, neighborhoods, streets, and squares. A clear example appears in Galata, a district of the Ottoman Constantinople, as you can see in this slide. This district was the main European trade and diplomatic center in Eurasian context, separated from the Muslim heart of the city on the opposite shore of the Bosphorus. The movement of Ottoman soldiers, Jewish brokers, and Christian merchants in and out of Galata was symbolized how movement across borders took place every day on a smaller scale too. But as you can imagine, not only people but also objects and ideas crossed the borders. Particularly, the movement of slaves, soldiers, merchants, and diplomatic agents prompt new circulation among areas subject to different political and religious belief. Often, these actors in movement gather several information during their travels as spies or informers. Then they pass such news on to friends, members of their families, or local authorities, giving the opportunity to discover in advance the rivals' plans of attack. At the same time, such news were useful also to improve the knowledge of distant places, cultures, and societies. In addition to the goods that merchants transported on their cargo, precious objects that Muslim and Christian political authorities exchanged as gifts were constantly in motion in the Mediterranean context. To cite just a few examples, one could witness in Constantinople the unloading in the port of numerous pieces of Murano glass given by the Republic of Venice to the Ottoman minister to embellish their mosques, or the arrival of exotic animals from the Maghreb in the ports of Marseille, as in the case of the lions sent by the Ottoman governor of Algiers to the French king in the mid-16th century. Just to conclude, the movement of people, ideas, and objects in the 16th century Mediterranean has shown the presence of theoretical borders that could be daily crossed despite cultural differences, military conflicts, and religious prohibition. All this reflects the early modern Mediterranean world not only as a context of war and violence, but also as a borderland characterized by intercultural exchange and interfaith dialogue. Many thanks for your attention.